In the final months of World War II, as the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of its own brutality, Europe descended into a chaotic landscape of destroyed cities, broken regimes, and frantic disappearances. Amid this turmoil, a new kind of network quietly awakened in the shadows, one that did not belong to governments or armies, but to a constellation of priests, monasteries, refugee offices, and covert sympathizers who believed they were protecting lost souls. This network would later be known by a single name whispered in archives and intelligence reports: the Ratline. By 1945, the Allies had begun compiling enormous lists of Nazi officers, SS commanders, concentration camp doctors, and collaborators who were to be arrested and prosecuted. Yet the chaos of post-war Europe created fertile ground for confusion. Millions were displaced. Borders were fluid. Lines between guilty and innocent blurred in refugee camps overflowing with people desperate to escape starvation, imprisonment, or revenge. It was in this environment of disorder that a hidden escape pipeline quietly took form. The trail started in Germany and Austria, where fugitives from the Nazi hierarchy slipped into Catholic institutions under assumed identities. Many arrived starving, unshaven, and terrified, carrying forged papers or none at all. Small monasteries, parish houses, and Red Cross stations became temporary sanctuaries, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. Church officials found themselves at a crossroads. In a world reduced to ashes, every desperate man claimed to be a victim. Without robust systems of verification, the Church's humanitarian networks became a shield for men whose crimes were far from hidden. From these early sanctuaries, the Ratline extended south toward the Alps. Villages along the Austrian, Italian border became crucial junctions. High in the mountains, shepherd paths and abandoned wartime trails were used to smuggle fugitives into Italy. Priests, monks, and local guides, often unaware of the true identities of the men they aided, provided food, shelter, and directions. For fugitives who once commanded armies, these treks represented their first experience of helplessness. Yet they pressed forward, knowing that every hour increased the chance of capture. Italy, fractured by occupation and liberation, became the heart of the escape system. Rome, in particular, emerged as the central hub. The Holy City, overwhelmed with refugees from across Europe, was a place where identities could vanish beneath the noise of desperation. Among its narrow streets and ancient structures stood the Pontifical Commission for Assistance, a Vatican office created to help displaced persons. It processed tens of thousands of refugees, granting them food, legal assistance, and shelter. Within this enormous humanitarian machine, a skilled fugitive could blend effortlessly. The key to vanishing completely lay in obtaining new documents. For many Nazis, the most valuable of all was a Red Cross travel pass. These temporary passports, meant for stateless refugees, required minimal documentation. A new name, a fabricated birthplace, and a priest's signature were often enough. Allies later discovered that dozens of high-ranking Nazi officials had secured their new identities through these channels. Once armed with fresh identities, the fugitives moved into a network of safe houses run by sympathetic clergy or intermediaries who specialized in arranging passage out of Europe. Some houses were modest parishes. Others were large religious institutions whose staff had no idea who actually slept in their rooms. The movement was careful, slow, and calculated. Each man traveled as a humble refugee, blending into crowds of ordinary people fleeing famine or political prosecution. By the late 1940s, the Ratline had become more than an improvised series of shelters. It was an underground logistics system. Money flowed through diplomatic pouches, donations, and secret accounts. Couriers ferried information between safe houses. Security tightened. Fugitive Nazis learned to adopt new mannerisms, new accents, even new religious habits. Some shaved their heads, others grew beards. The most notorious changed their names entirely. Their final destination was almost always the same: the port cities of Genoa and Rome. From there, Ships bound for South America became escape vessels for men who had orchestrated genocide. Argentina, ruled by a government openly sympathetic to former Nazis, became the most common refuge. Once aboard, fugitives watched Europe shrink behind them and felt the weight of their crimes recede, if only temporarily. Back in Europe, Allied investigators began to notice troubling inconsistencies. War criminals whose captures were expected suddenly vanished. Informants reported seeing men who were supposedly dead. Documents surfaced showing identical photos under different names. Whispered rumors of a church-backed escape network reached intelligence offices in London, Washington, and Paris. Yet proof remained elusive. The humanitarian chaos of post-war Europe made every trail confusing, every clue unreliable. Still, patterns emerged. Officers who had served in the Balkans seemed to follow identical routes. Former SS men disappeared after visiting certain monasteries along the Austrian-Italian border. Red Cross officials questioned suspicious applications but were overruled by higher authorities. Something was moving these men, something organized, something powerful, something that understood the gaps in Europe's post-war systems. As the decade ended, the Ratline had already transported hundreds of Nazi fugitives out of Europe. Some would live quietly under false names. Others would rebuild influence overseas. A few would even re-enter politics or military research, hiding behind the anonymity gifted to them by a network that believed it was saving souls, or by individuals who believed they were saving something else entirely. Operation Ratline, once a rumor, had become a ghostly structure of tunnels, forged identities, and sanctified shelters. And yet, beneath the marble halls of Rome and the quiet chapels of the Alps, the truth remained buried, protected by silence, lost paperwork, and the moral ambiguity of a world trying to rebuild itself from ruin. This was only the beginning. As Allied war crimes investigators expanded their reach across Europe, Rome became the vortex of unanswered questions. Intelligence agents noted that too many high-value Nazi fugitives were disappearing within a few square miles of Vatican territory. The Holy See, an independent sovereign state packed tightly inside the city, was surrounded by ancient walls, narrow alleyways, private archives, and diplomatic protections. To those studying the patterns, it seemed impossible that so many men could simply vanish after arriving in the Eternal City. Investigators soon realized that the Vatican's refugee infrastructure, massive, overwhelmed, and disorganized, was the perfect cover for someone seeking to disappear. Warehouses filled with donated clothing, dormitories overcrowded with displaced families, and offices processing thousands of desperate people each week created a fog in which any identity could dissolve. The chaos of compassion became a shield against scrutiny. One of the most critical nodes in this system lay at the Pontifical Commission for Assistance. Humanitarian by design, the commission functioned as a distribution point for food, clothing, and travel documents. Priests and volunteers worked tirelessly, recording the names of refugees, issuing vouchers, and stamping paperwork. Their mission was overwhelming, and records later revealed that many officials did not even glance at the papers handed to them. What mattered most was efficiency, getting food to the starving and transport to the displaced. But in this noble haste, men with histories written in blood passed through the same lines as widows, orphans, and victims. Behind the public work, however, more discreet channels existed. Vatican properties, due to their diplomatic status, were beyond the reach of Allied soldiers and Italian police. Within these sanctuaries, fugitives found an environment where a new identity could be molded carefully and safely, away from prying eyes. Some found refuge in small monastic guest rooms. Others hid in sprawling religious institutions where hundreds of clergy moved like rivers through stone cloisters. In such places, one more unfamiliar face attracted no comment. But the most decisive turning point for many fugitives came when they reached the office of Bishop Hudel, an Austrian cleric whose actions would later place him at the center of the Ratline controversy. Hudel oversaw the German-speaking Catholic community in Rome, and had long been an outspoken opponent of Allied denazification policies. In the crumbling world after the war, he believed the Church had a duty to offer forgiveness and refuge, even to those who had served the Nazi regime. His interpretation of mercy, however, blurred dangerously into complicity. Under his influence, the obtaining of false identity papers became startlingly easy. Udall issued certificates stating that individuals were good Catholics, in need of relocation or protection. These letters, stamped with ecclesiastical authority, carried enormous weight. Combined with Red Cross travel passes, documents that could be secured with minimal verification, fugitives gained the ability to move freely within Italy and eventually leave Europe altogether. As the Ratline matured into an organized escape system, couriers began transporting envelopes containing money, photographs, and coded instructions between safe houses. Some envelopes held baptismal certificates with newly invented names. Others contained recommendations from clergy who vouched for refugees they had never met. The Church's vast bureaucratic machinery, typically slow and deliberate, suddenly became an express lane for men fleeing justice. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence grew increasingly suspicious. Reports from field agents described sightings of known SS officers walking calmly in Roman markets or stepping from cars that bore Vatican diplomatic plates. Informants within the refugee camps began passing along rumors. Certain priests asked no questions. Certain offices processed paperwork unusually quickly. Certain clergy members insisted on helping special cases. The patterns were unmistakable, yet no one could prove anything. Vatican sovereignty placed many of the suspected locations off limits. On the ground, investigators found only dead ends. A monastery would be identified, but by the time Allied forces arrived, the guest room was empty. A name would surface, an alias used by several fugitives, but its trail always dissolved into the paperwork of humanitarian offices. Every thread pulled led to another labyrinth of forms, stamps, and holy seals. The more investigators searched, the more the Ratline seemed to shift and retreat, as if the city itself were conspiring to protect those moving through its shadows. The Vatican, for its part, maintained a strict public stance rooted in its humanitarian mission. It argued that the Church offered aid indiscriminately, without political bias, and that the overwhelming scale of suffering in post-war Europe left little room for perfect record-keeping. In many cases, this defense was true. The chaos was real, and the Church had indeed saved countless innocent lives. Yet this same chaos provided the perfect veil for those who sought to exploit it. The most notorious fugitives, men like Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele, did not pass through Rome without assistance. Intelligence later pieced together fragments of their movements: a coastal monastery, a safe house in Trastevere, a discreet contact who provided funds, a forged identity crafted with ecclesiastical signatures. These fragments formed a shadowy map, one that traced a path from the burning ruins of Europe to ships bound for Buenos Aires. By 1947, the Ratline had become so effective that entire groups of fugitives traveled together, posing as displaced laborers. Some Catholic aid workers, unaware of the truth, filled out their paperwork with sympathy. Others suspected the truth but believed the Church's spiritual mission outweighed secular justice. A few, like Udall, actively facilitated the escapes. And while the Vatican never officially endorsed any form of protection for war criminals, the systems under its control functioned with enough loopholes that the results were indistinguishable from intentional aid. Documents with Vatican stamps appeared in intelligence files. Travel passes signed by clergymen surfaced in South American archives, and testimonies from captured Nazis repeatedly described priests, monasteries, and church officials who opened doors at critical moments. Despite mounting suspicions, diplomatic sensitivities prevented direct confrontation. The Allies, eager to rebuild Europe and prevent communist expansion, could not afford a public rift with the Vatican. Thus, the Ratline continued to operate in an unspoken space, a gray zone where moral ambiguity collided with geopolitical necessity. By the late 1940s, ships leaving Italian ports carried not just innocent refugees escaping devastation, but also men whose crimes represented some of the darkest chapters in human history. As these vessels slipped into the Mediterranean, disappearing over the horizon, the last traces of their passengers faded into secrecy. Behind them, in Rome's tangled streets and sacred halls, the Ratline remained intact, its operations still invisible, its protectors still unknown. The escape network had become a living organism, adaptive, decentralized, and constantly shifting. And as Part 2 closes, its full extent remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered piece by piece in the decades that followed. As the 1950s unfolded, Rome became a city of resolved scars and unopened wounds. Reconstruction erased the rubble and rebuilt the streets, but beneath the surface, the Ratline's ghost lingered in old monastery cellars, dusty file rooms, and the memories of priests who preferred silence over confession. The war was over, the world had moved on, but the roots that had once carried fleeing war criminals out of Europe had left behind faint but traceable footprints that investigators would slowly uncover. The first major breakthrough came not through intelligence work, but through the fragility of memory. A former Vatican functionary, long retired, recounted fragmented recollections of unusual visitors during the late 1940s, men who arrived at odd hours, carrying almost nothing, seeking immediate transit papers. He remembered faces obscured by exhaustion and fear, and documents stamped quickly without scrutiny. His testimony alone proved nothing, but it aligned with a growing collection of small disclosures emerging from former Red Cross workers, port officials, and parish volunteers. The patterns that investigators had failed to assemble during the war now began to coalesce. Latin America, which had once seemed too distant and too politically complicated to probe, opened its archives slowly, revealing immigration records that bore unmistakable traces of the Ratline. Among these were aliases long suspected by intelligence services, forged identities supported by baptismal certificates issued in Italy, and Red Cross travel passes that had bypassed standard verification procedures. The re-examination of these documents illuminated a troubling chain of legitimacy. Each forged identity was supported by multiple layers of papers, stamps, and endorsements from religious institutions. Some certificates were crudely fabricated, but others were so meticulously crafted that even seasoned investigators mistook them for authentic. It became clear that the Ratline had not been a rogue operation confined to a handful of conspirators. It was a network that thrived because it blended into the humanitarian machinery of a continent in crisis. At the same time, testimonies emerged from South American communities where former Nazis had lived quietly for decades. Neighbors recalled men who spoke little of their past, who attended church diligently, and who lived with an air of permanent caution. Their presence seemed mysterious only in hindsight. At the time, they had appeared no different from the thousands of Europeans fleeing post-war devastation. Yet beneath these quiet lives lay the consequences of a system that had transported them safely across the world. The most revealing evidence surfaced when investigators gained access to previously restricted government files. Intelligence agencies in the United States, Britain, and West Germany had long maintained reports detailing the movements of high-value Nazis through Italy. Many of these records indicated that the Ratline was not unknown to Western powers. In fact, some fugitives had been deliberately monitored, not to capture them, but to track their movements for future geopolitical leverage. As the Cold War deepened, the ideological struggle against the Soviet Union overshadowed the pursuit of justice, and some officials viewed former Nazis as assets rather than criminals. This geopolitical lens reframed the Ratline's existence. The Vatican's motivations were complex, mired in fears of communism, concerns for religious refugees, and internal debates over moral responsibility. Meanwhile, Western intelligence services saw potential value in men who possessed knowledge of Soviet military strategies, scientific expertise, or connections within anti-communist networks. The result was an unspoken convergence of interests, a silent accommodation that allowed the Ratline to function without direct obstruction. Still, the Vatican's role remained the most contentious piece of the puzzle. Its extensive archives contained the answers historians sought, but access to these documents was tightly restricted. Occasionally, a file surfaced, misplaced, leaked, or released unintentionally, that hinted at deeper involvement. Letters from clergy expressing concern about special refugees, notes regarding travel arrangements, or memos acknowledging that certain individuals were under the care of church officials. These fragments suggested that even those who disagreed with the operation understood its scale. Yet it would be inaccurate to portray the church as a unified actor. The Ratline operated in the shadows, often without the knowledge of the majority of clergy. Many church workers had genuinely believed they were helping innocent victims. Others had acted out of fear of communist expansion, convinced that aiding anti-communists, regardless of their past, served a higher purpose. A few, like Bishop Hudel, had held ideological sympathies that guided their actions. But there was never a centralized directive, only a fragmented series of actions, decisions, and omissions that collectively produced a powerful escape mechanism. By the 1970s, public pressure for transparency grew stronger as more evidence surfaced, particularly in South American trials involving Nazi fugitives. The Ratline became a subject of international debate, forcing historians, journalists, and religious scholars to confront the unsettling reality of how readily justice can be obscured when humanitarian systems lack oversight. The revelation sparked outrage and soul-searching, both within the church and across global institutions responsible for post-war reconciliation. In the decades that followed, new information emerged periodically, testimonies released by aging clergy, letters discovered in forgotten boxes, immigration files declassified by foreign ministries. Each new disclosure added another piece to a mosaic that was already painfully clear. The Ratline had been real, extensive, and devastatingly effective. It had provided the world's most wanted men with safe passage at a time when their crimes demanded accountability. As the historical record solidified, one crucial question persisted. Could such a network have existed without institutional blindness? The answer, historians concluded, lay in the unprecedented chaos of the post-war period. Europe's moral and physical infrastructure had collapsed, and systems meant to protect the vulnerable had become vulnerable themselves. In that vacuum, fugitives exploited the good intentions of others, slipping through the cracks of a world still reeling from catastrophe. The legacy of the Ratline continues to reverberate. It stands as a reminder of how easily ideals, mercy, charity, redemption, can be manipulated when institutions fail to enforce accountability. It also exposes the moral dangers of geopolitical pragmatism, where short-term strategic interests overshadow the long-term demands of justice. In the end, the Ratline story is not just about the escape of war criminals. It is a cautionary tale about the fragile boundary between compassion and complicity, about the hidden paths that emerge when oversight falters, and about the layers of secrecy that can accumulate beneath even the most venerable institutions. As history closed the book on hundreds of men who slipped away into new lives, the unanswered questions remained sealed in archives, concealed within monastic walls, or buried with those who had once walked the hidden corridors of Rome. The Ratline had faded, but the shadows it cast continued to stretch across decades, serving as an enduring testament to the perilous intersection of faith, power, and moral ambiguity.